a recent incident that has stirred widespread debate. A black woman reported being denied her first-class seat on a flight by a flight attendant under circumstances she described as discriminatory. She had purchased a ticket for a first-class seat, only to face a situation where her rightful place was questioned. According to her account, the flight attendant seemed to question the legitimacy of her seat, despite her having the appropriate documentation. The passenger recalled feeling humiliated as the situation escalated. Other passengers allegedly observed the interaction, with some stepping in to vouch for her. Ultimately, she was allowed to take her seat after persistent advocacy, but the experience left her feeling demeaned and outraged. The airline involved released a statement indicating an investigation into the incident and reiterated its commitment to non-discrimination policies. This situation is not isolated, as it joins a string of similar incidents involving passengers of color. Critics argue that such occurrences reflect underlying biases that persist in customer service, even in environments that should prioritize professionalism and equality. The broader conversation sparked by this event focuses on how systemic racial issues manifest in subtle yet impactful ways, especially in spaces like air travel that are often seen as equalizers. The woman shared her story online, receiving an outpouring of support from social media users who resonated with her frustration and anger. Many called for more comprehensive training for airline staff to ensure equity in treatment and to address implicit biases that could lead to such confrontations. The case remains a reminder of the importance of accountability in ensuring that all passengers feel respected and valued, regardless of their background. After the woman's story began to gain attention, it became a rallying point for discussions about racial inequities in customer service. Social media platforms amplified her account, with individuals sharing similar experiences they had faced in settings like airlines, restaurants, or retail spaces. The story resonated deeply, as many saw it as yet another example of implicit bias being exercised in a way that diminishes the dignity of black individuals. As the narrative unfolded, it became clear that the flight attendant's behavior, while possibly unintentional, reflected a broader issue of unequal treatment. The flight attendant reportedly questioned the woman's presence in first class in a manner that the passenger felt was unjustified and based solely on her race. This prompted further public outcry, with many urging airlines to address potential biases among their staff through improved training and policy enforcement. The airline's response to the incident was met with mixed reactions. While their commitment to conducting a thorough investigation was noted, critics argued that the systemic issues at play required more than reactive measures. Proactive strategies, such as mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for airline employees, were demanded by advocacy groups and the public. The woman herself emphasized in her follow-up statements that her experience was about more than one isolated moment. It was a reflection of systemic prejudices that need to be dismantled. Support for the woman grew as her story became a viral touchpoint. Community leaders, activists, and even some celebrities expressed solidarity, highlighting that such incidents, though seemingly minor, contribute to a broader pattern of marginalization that many black individuals encounter daily. The incident sparked calls for transparency from the airline industry as a whole, with consumers demanding clearer accountability measures when allegations of discrimination arise. The woman's resilience and willingness to share her experience were praised widely, as she framed her narrative not just as a personal grievance but as a moment to advocate for broader change. She underscored that the issue was not about receiving compensation or apologies, but about ensuring that no one else would have to endure a similar situation. Her story has become part of a larger movement demanding respect, equality, and fairness across all customer service sectors. The woman's story began to serve as a powerful example of how subtle acts of bias can perpetuate inequality in everyday life. Conversations about the incident extended far beyond social media, reaching news outlets and public forums where issues of racial discrimination and systemic inequities were being discussed. Many individuals saw parallels between her experience and broader societal patterns, emphasizing the need for ongoing advocacy to ensure fair treatment across industries. The airline's investigation became a focal point, With the public demanding updates and transparency in their findings, advocacy groups pressured the company to not only resolve the issue at hand but also implement structural changes. Proposals ranged from creating robust anti-discrimination policies to setting up independent bodies to handle complaints of racial bias. Many argued that such measures were critical to rebuilding trust and demonstrating a genuine commitment to equality. Meanwhile, the woman continued to speak out, framing her ordeal as a learning opportunity for corporations and individuals alike. She highlighted how the incident reflected broader challenges faced by black travelers, including feeling scrutinized, stereotyped, or overlooked in spaces where they should feel entitled to the same respect and privileges as anyone else. Her willingness to share her story inspired many others to come forward with their own accounts, amplifying calls for systemic change. Public discourse also turned to the role of implicit bias and the need for better education in recognizing and addressing it. Experts weighed in, noting that biases often operate unconsciously, but their impacts can be profound and damaging. Training programs that go beyond superficial diversity initiatives were recommended, with an emphasis on fostering empathy, understanding historical contexts, and equipping employees with tools to prevent discriminatory behavior. The ripple effect of the incident was far-reaching. It reignited discussions about representation, equity, and justice within industries that cater to the public. For many, the story was a painful reminder of the work still needed to achieve genuine inclusivity, but it also became a symbol of resistance and the power of speaking truth to power. The woman's experience, though deeply personal, became a catalyst for collective action and a renewed commitment to confronting injustice wherever it appears. The momentum surrounding the incident continued to grow, with discussions extending into workplace policies, travel forums, and legal advocacy groups. Organizations began to scrutinize their own protocols, fearing similar allegations of racial discrimination could surface. Experts in diversity and inclusion emphasize that addressing such biases requires more than surface-level remedies. Systemic changes, like regular assessments of employee behaviors and clear avenues for reporting incidents without fear of reprisal, became central recommendations. For the woman at the heart of the story, the days following the incident were overwhelming. While she received an outpouring of support, she also faced pushback from skeptics questioning the legitimacy of her claims. This duality highlighted the emotional toll such incidents take on victims of discrimination, particularly when their experiences are put under public scrutiny. In interviews and public statements, she remained resolute, underscoring the need to continue fighting for fairness. Her focus turned toward advocacy, connecting with other individuals and groups working to combat bias in the travel industry. She expressed a desire to use her experience as a stepping stone to create change, not just for herself but for future generations of travelers who should never feel their identity might lead to unequal treatment. The airline, under growing public pressure, began implementing new measures to address bias among staff. Reports emerged that they were partnering with external consultants to overhaul their diversity training programs, ensuring they were more comprehensive and impactful. This step was seen as a positive sign, though many emphasized that lasting change would depend on consistent follow-through and accountability. The story continued to resonate globally, inspiring conversations about what true inclusivity looks like in modern society. From travel bloggers to human rights organizations, the narrative became a rallying cry for those advocating for dignity and respect in all spaces. The woman's voice, initially isolated in a moment of frustration and hurt, had grown into a powerful call for justice, echoing far beyond the confines of that single flight. The ongoing aftermath of the incident began to catalyze broader movements within and beyond the airline industry. Advocacy organizations used the incident to amplify discussions about systemic racism in public services, calling for comprehensive reform to address bias in customer interactions. These groups highlighted that the airline's actions or inactions would set a precedent for how corporations handle similar allegations moving forward. Meanwhile, the woman became an unexpected figure in the fight for equality, receiving invitations to speak at events and collaborate with civil rights organizations. Her story resonated with many who had endured similar indignities, and she sought to channel the momentum into constructive action. She partnered with legal experts and activists to propose policy changes, including a standardized incident reporting system for passengers who feel discriminated against during their travels. The airline, facing significant public pressure, pledged transparency in its investigation and began implementing immediate changes. They introduced real-time bias training modules for employees, rolled out a revamped complaint resolution system, and hosted forums with travelers to rebuild trust. Critics, however, cautioned that these steps needed sustained commitment, pointing to past corporate promises that fell short of creating substantive change. Public reactions remain divided, with strong support from social justice advocates and skepticism from those resistant to the idea of systemic racism influencing day-to-day interactions. Social media debates about privilege, bias, and the lived experiences of marginalized groups added layers of complexity to the discourse. Influencers and celebrities also joined the conversation, leveraging their platforms to amplify calls for accountability and progress. As the story continued to unfold, it was clear that the incident had ignited more than outrage. It sparked a broader reckoning with how people of different races are treated in spaces designed to be impartial. For the woman at the center, her experience became a painful but powerful chapter in a larger narrative of change, one that aimed to ensure every individual receives the respect and equality they deserve, regardless of their background. The ripple effects of the incident continued to expand, prompting deeper discussions about systemic biases in various industries. Advocacy groups seized the moment to push for broader reforms, emphasizing the need for systemic solutions rather than reactive responses. Calls for accountability extended beyond the airline industry, with individuals and organizations recognizing parallels in other customer-facing sectors such as hospitality, retail, and public transportation. For the woman at the center of the controversy, her life was irrevocably changed. What began as an isolated incident had transformed her into an advocate for equity. She received countless messages from others who had experienced similar moments of bias or discrimination but lacked the platform to voice their experiences. Many shared stories of being questioned, doubted, or outright dismissed in spaces where they should have felt safe and equal. Recognizing the potential to create meaningful change, she collaborated with civil rights leaders to launch a broader campaign aimed at addressing inequities in air travel. This initiative included advocating for legislation that would mandate bias training for airline staff and establish independent review boards for passenger complaints. These efforts sought to ensure that no one else would have to endure the same humiliation and injustice she had faced. In the public sphere, the story continued to fuel heated debates. Supporters praised her courage and called for systemic change, while detractors questioned her motives or downplayed the significance of the incident. The polarization underscored the challenges of addressing implicit bias. While progress was being made in some areas, resistance to acknowledging the depth of systemic racism remained strong in others. The airline industry, under intense scrutiny, began rolling out new initiatives aimed at fostering inclusivity and rebuilding trust. Competitor airlines also took notice, preemptively reviewing their policies and training protocols to avoid similar scandals. Travel advocacy organizations applauded these efforts but emphasized that meaningful change would require a long-term commitment to transparency and accountability. For many, the woman's story became emblematic of a larger struggle, a reminder that even in spaces meant to be neutral, disparities persist. It galvanized a movement, with individuals, organizations, and even policymakers working together to create a future where every traveler is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. As the story gained more traction, it became clear that this incident was far from an isolated case. People began sharing their own accounts of facing racial bias in various public settings, adding weight to the argument that systemic racism persists even in spaces designed for impartiality, such as airlines. These stories were amplified by advocacy groups and influencers, sparking a wave of public support for comprehensive change. The woman at the center of the controversy found herself thrust into a national conversation about racial justice. She used her platform to address the broader implications of her experience, emphasizing that the issue wasn't simply about one flight or one airline but about dismantling a culture of inequality. Her advocacy efforts gained momentum, drawing support from civil rights organizations, legal experts, and fellow activists. Meanwhile, airlines across the country were compelled to re-examine their policies. Public pressure led to several carriers implementing more robust anti-bias training for their staff. Additionally, some airlines began trialing anonymous reporting systems for passengers to flag discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. Consumer watchdog groups monitored these efforts closely, urging airlines to back their promises with measurable results. The media continued to spotlight the incident, turning it into a case study of how corporations handle allegations of bias. Experts weighed in, discussing how implicit bias can manifest in customer service settings and offering strategies for preventing such issues in the future. The narrative sparked valuable dialogue about the intersections of race, privilege, and accessibility in public spaces. For the woman, the journey was both empowering and challenging. While she received widespread support, she also faced scrutiny and backlash from detractors who questioned her account or downplayed its significance. Despite this, she remained resolute, viewing the backlash as further proof of the need for cultural and systemic shifts. Her story, once a painful personal ordeal, had become a beacon for change. It illuminated the pervasive nature of everyday racism and inspired a collective push for equity and justice. The momentum built around her experience fueled hope that future travelers, regardless of their race or background, might finally experience the fair and respectful treatment they deserve. The story continued to reverberate across social and traditional media, turning the initial incident into a broader symbol of the challenges faced by marginalized groups in spaces of privilege and power. Civil rights organizations rallied behind the woman, framing her experience as a glaring example of microaggressions and systemic biases that often go unaddressed. These groups called on the airline industry to adopt transparent and enforceable policies to combat racial discrimination at every level, from training staff to handling passenger complaints. The public's response remained highly polarized. On one side, there was an outpouring of empathy and solidarity, with supporters pointing out how incidents like this undermine the principle of equal treatment. On the other, skeptics dismissed the event as a misunderstanding or questioned whether race played a role at all. This divide sparked intense debates about the realities of implicit bias and the lingering impact of systemic racism in society. The woman at the center of the controversy, while grateful for the widespread support, also faced the emotional toll of reliving the incident as it was dissected in the public eye. She maintained her focus on advocacy, collaborating with legal experts to draft recommendations for stronger anti-discrimination measures in customer service industries. These proposals included mandatory cultural sensitivity training, better mechanisms for reporting bias, and the establishment of third-party oversight bodies to handle complaints impartially. The incident also spurred broader conversations about representation. Advocacy groups argued that increasing diversity among airline staff and leadership could help mitigate biases and foster a more inclusive environment. Airlines began to explore these recommendations, with some announcing initiatives to hire and promote individuals from underrepresented communities. Despite the challenges, the woman remained steadfast in her mission to turn a painful experience into a catalyst for positive change. Her story became a rallying cry for those demanding fairness and respect, not just in air travel but in all areas of public life. It served as a reminder that even small moments of bias can have profound consequences and that addressing them requires both individual accountability and systemic reform.